Now to the patient, Mr. Kramer.
I have patience. I'm not sick. But thank you. And by the way, Madam Chair, thank you for the hearing, and thank all of you for your testimony, for being here. And it really didn't require any patience at all. This is really quite interesting to me and fascinating. So I appreciate everybody being here. I have to admit that sometimes when I hear about these sparsely populated states like Vermont and their digital divide, I start feeling a little guilty, because when I look at North Dakota, it's hard to claim a divide. Now, there are some places, but we have over 90% of our population that has 100 Mbps or more, and 92 that are over 25, 93 over 25. So while there still are a few spots, our folks do a great job. And Ms. Bloomfield, you know well that, and this is one of the concerns I want to get to here with regard to some of this policy, that many of your members in North Dakota were broadband before broadband was cool. They were efficiently using federal support funds to build out broadband long before it was mandated by either tradition or policy. And one of the things I worry a little bit about as we talk about, and I support, let's get to unserved before underserved. That's really important. We want to have that bridge. I mean, it would be kind of crazy to have an interstate that they decided to gravel, for a couple miles in Montana or something. But as each generation comes and the demands get greater, and in places like North Dakota, where it's not just education, it's not just healthcare, huge, really huge. Other business, really important. Access to market is really important. But even safety, environmental safety, SCADA systems that that have to work on our oil pipelines and our gas pipelines, and of course our big transmission lines as we generate a lot of electricity. All of that will require upgrades. And so as we talk about the efficient deployment of federal funds, I want to make sure that we have protections for upgrading as well. Does that make sense? And maybe I start with you, Ms. Bloomfield, to comment, and anybody else who would like to.
You are absolutely spot on. And again, thank you for your leadership on all of these issues. And I think people are always surprised that North Dakota actually is probably one of the most fiber-rich states in the country, because when you look at that landmass, it's pretty amazing. But in part, when you're really that rural, you actually see what broadband can do to kind of narrow that gap that geography creates. So the ability to do telemedicine, the ability to actually bring communities together to do economic development. And then when you had the oil industry coming in, the ability to make sure that that economic enterprise was absolutely able to be supported. So the fact that you're focused, because people get so focused on building and they forget about the fact that you've got to maintain that network. Otherwise, down the road, you don't have anything but a capacity that is limited by, what it was when it was actually built. So the ability to live and breathe. The other thing that I would tout, particularly in a state like North Dakota, is the ability of the carriers to collaborate with one another. They've created DCN, a state fiber network, the ability for them to realize that all boats rise. If they are able to build that infrastructure out further, all of the carriers in the state actually benefit from it, and the state itself benefits from it.
Well, I might just to add a couple of statistics for others to comment. There are only 3 states that have less population density than North Dakota, but there are 20 states and territories that actually have less connectivity than North Dakota. So it can be done. But I also wonder, some of these other states have a lot of federal lands, and we've been talking about that. We do not. We have some, but not a lot. It's not a barrier for us. I think state policy does matter, and while I agree that communities ought to have some competitiveness about how they and some control over their own regulation, there should be a minimum standard that makes sure that the country is connected as well. But Mr. Spalter, you wanted to comment?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more that the cost of maintaining and upgrading networks for underserved areas is only escalating. It's a multiplier of what the build costs actually are. And we know that particularly as we're seeing this extraordinary spike in the data that's being put through these networks from an increasingly small number of actually internet companies that are sending video to customers around the country, that this is even becoming more profound. So I completely agree with your insight, but also your initiative via 4832 to not only think through opportunities to serve communities that have been impacted by disaster, but also to better serve communities that already have broadband.
Yeah. Well, I think we've certainly learned some things in the last year that can be helpful in that. So why not apply it across the board and avoid special circumstances? Anybody else?
I would just offer, sir, when you talk about upgrades, it's really, really important to remember how these upgrades are accomplished. One of the things that I mentioned in my comments were about, you know, this sexy issue of pole attachments. It's incredibly important when you have either, you know, whether it's an attachment to a pole or a conduit. It seems like our policy is anytime something new happens to the pole or the conduit, that is a new starting point for a long application process for fees and other things of that nature, rather than saying, how can we simplify this process? One touch, make ready. Simplifying this to make sure that we get attachments on the poles, internet lines through the conduits to get broadband out there faster. So I hope you factor that into your thinking as well.
Another reason not to nationalize anything. With that, I yield back.